Hello, Stephen.
Good morning, Michelle. How are you?
I am good, thank you. How are you? Happy to be back. You were off last week.
I was off last week, and I think we should go ahead and announce it. So, folks, for the time being, which means through the end of November, we're going to switch to a bi-weekly schedule. So this is the first of the bi-weekly. I'm getting kind of busy, and I work part-time. I'm working on a new project for the Apex community that we'll be announcing on October 11th. It's going to be very exciting. It's taking a lot of my time. So we're going to shift around the way I'm using my time for the next couple of months. But I don't think any of you will regret it.
No, really looking forward to it. I think everybody will be very excited. So looking forward to that. So October 11th, big
October
announcement.
11th,
Okay.
big announcement. Put it in your calendars, or just be on Twitter or something.
Hey, you queued up today's show with big title, Saving the Planet. That's sounds very intriguing.
Save the planet with result cache. Yes, well, so I did that for two reasons. One is, of course, we need to have the clickbait titles so that hordes of people will join our call, thousands each bi-weekly. But also because I've just decided that I'm not missing an opportunity to remind all of us that it is code red time in terms of the climate crisis. So the IPCC and all these scientists come out with all these statements about how really critical it is that we change the way we do things. And then we kind of go back to normal because it's very hard to not go back to normal. So I'm really struggling against that, which is why pretty much every day I'm out in the woods, cutting back invasives, healing the ecosystems, pulling out stilt grass by the ton in my yard. I should show you some pictures of that. Every one of us can find ways to help heal the planet every single day, whether it's avoiding single-use plastic, actually directly going out into your areas, your ecosystems, and helping fix them. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with me directly. DM me on Twitter, send me an email saying, how do you think I can make a difference? And I'll help you figure out how to make a difference in your community. Kevin, yes. Nice to hear from you from Chicago, my home for 30 plus years.
I love Chicago.
So spinning back to the result cache. So we're going to talk about this really, really cool feature that should, in theory, reduce the amount of CPU necessary to run your applications, therefore reducing the energy burn on your application, therefore helping heal the planet, or at least do our little bit to combat the ridiculous amounts of energy being consumed to mine Bitcoins. I hate cryptocurrencies. Okay, right. Let's stick to the topic. So share my screen.
I will share your screen.
So the basic idea behind the result cache is it answers this question. If I need to get some data and present it to the users or use it within my application, and the data hasn't changed since the last time I got it, it'd be really nice to spend the least amount of effort, resources, et cetera, to get that. Specifically, for example, if I'm querying data from a materialized view, let's say, and the data in the materialized view hasn't changed, why should I go ahead and execute the query over and over again? Even if the query is optimized and the materialized view is indexed, there's still a whole bunch of steps that the engine goes through to parse or check for parsing the query, et cetera, et cetera. So it'd be really nice if we could find a way, a neat, elegant, transparent way to avoid excessive retrievals of data when not necessary. That's what the function result cache is all about. And there's a related SQL result cache, which I probably won't get to today, but the concept is the same. So let's just dive right in. I've created this package called FRC demo. It's built around the FRC employees table. Not sure why I made a copy, but I did. So here's a package with a bunch of different functions that return data. So this gets the last name for an employee ID. This gets all the last names for a department. This gets all the employees for a given department. So this returns a collection of strings. This returns a collection of records that are defined here. Associative arrays, as you can see. And what I've done is add a cool little keyword called result cache. In fact, let's take the result cache keyword out. And then we'll run this code. I'll show you the code in a second. Get rid of all the result caches. I think that's it. Okay. So here's my lookup of my employee, get the last name for the ID. And notice I say, hey, I ran this function. Get all the last names for a department using the cool bulk collect feature, and a little statement saying, hey, I ran this function. And then the third one, get all the records. So select star into my collection of records Yes, I was here too. So let's create this package. Let's reconnect. Let's create the package. Let's create the package body. Okay. And now let's just run this one little script that I wrote here, which says, get me the last name for this ID, and do it 10 times. And as you would expect, generally, when I say call this function for this input value, it executed the body of the function, and it executed 10 times. Okay, so that's how, PL SQL works. Now, let's go and reverse all my changes. I'll reverse that change. Now what I've done is, the only change I'm going to make is add the result cache keyword to the header in the spec and the body, recompile my package, recompile my package body, and now let's run that same block of code again. And oh my gosh, we just helped save the planet. So now you can see that the function was only, the body of the function was only executed once. And the next 9 times, the database said, oh, you want the last name for ID 138? I've got that for you saved in a special little result cache. So the result, so this is the basic feature of the result cache. Basically, when I say that I want a result function to have a result cache, then essentially the database sets up a little area within the library pool for result caching, and the DBAs have to set it up properly and all that kind of stuff, make sure it's the right size. But then it has a little section in that big cache for this function and this parameter value. So basically, this is the index. The parameter list is the index into the cache. So when I call last name for employee ID 138 the first time, it looks in the cache and says, oh, nothing there for 138. And it runs the function, returns the value, and stores 138 and the name that goes with it. The next time I call this function, or anybody in the database instance, it's not per session, it's per instance. The next time anybody calls the function and passes 138, the database does a little lookup and says, oh, I got a hit for 138, and it simply passes back the name. Isn't that cool? So that's why we get this kind of behavior. Instead of 10 executions of the function, just one. Mm-hmm.
So a last name is, I guess, pretty static until you get married or divorced or something. Then what happens? So does it ever expire? Or
yeah, so for a long time in the world of PL SQL, now I'm talking about before 11G, so for us old timers, you used to be able to get this kind of behavior by creating caches within your package. I could create essentially a collection in the package and store my cached information there and avoid basically running the execution of the function. And that's super duper fast, but I have to manage it myself, and it's per session. So the cool thing about this result cache is that Oracle takes care of everything for us. We can still screw it up. And I'm going to talk about how you can screw up the result cache in my next Feuertip, because it's just too complicated to get into in one session. But the basic idea is that Oracle creates and manages the cache. So as the function is called, it incrementally adds to the cache as more people call it for different employee IDs. More information is added to the cache. And then I'll talk about the generalities, and I'll show you this, and I'll demonstrate it in a script. But then, as you say, the table can change. So what if I go ahead and make a change in my session to that table? Then in my session, the cache for that function is disabled. In fact, any cache that's built on or relies on this table will be disabled in my session because I've made changes. So that cache can't be trusted for me, but for everybody else, it's fine. Now, as soon as I commit a change for the table that any of these caches relies on, then all the caches dependent on that table are wiped clean, they're invalidated, and you have to restart filling it up. So basically, Oracle guarantees clean data as long as you don't screw it up. And again, we'll talk about how you can screw it up next week. Make sense so far? Okay. So let's just run through a couple more examples. So that's the basic idea. Run it once, and then we say that we just use the value from the cache. Now, again, I can also do this for collections of records, collections of strings, and so on. So let's run this piece of code. So now what I'm going to do is get all the last names for Department 50, drop it into a collection, and I'll see how many I've got. since I'm calling it for the first time with department 50, it should run the body of the function. Then I'm going to look up the last name for 198, and I'll talk about why I do that. Then I'll do 50, once again, all the last names, and the last names for 60. So I run this piece of code. So getting all the last names for department 50, executed the body of the function. I'm sorry, this is executed the body of that function. And then I got my 50. And then I called my function 198. Now, the point I want to make here is that even though 198 is in department 50, it's not already cached. The cache is related to the function itself. So since I only called this function so far, nothing's been cached for this function. So even though this data was actually retrieved and is sitting in the collection, entirely different cache. So it runs this function again. Then I'm going to get all the last names for 60, so it ran the function, and then I'm going to get, notice that it didn't run the function for 50 again. I don't see that message for 50. So the point is that for returning scalars, returning collections of records, returning collections of scalars, you can use the result cache for all of those. There certainly are limitations. You can't return collections of blobs. You can't have a blob parameter and use that as a result cache parameter list, because remember, the parameter list is the index into the cache. No indexing on clobs and blobs and object types and things like that. So there are certainly some constraints about how you can use this. But for most of the everyday kind of APIs we build, really, really powerful. Any questions so far? Doesn't look like it.
We do, sorry. I dropped out because I think we have a bit of an audio issue. There was some feedback, but looks like it might be okay. So Kevin wishes that Oracle could figure out when to use the result function instead of the developer.
So the interesting thing, so it's an interesting idea. Of course, we'd love Oracle to do everything that it could do automatically for us. And there are other areas where this will come up in our conversation about the result cache. The general concern about doing it automatically, though, is that you don't want Oracle to overdo caching. Oracle has to be very careful about not delivering dirty data to you. And as I said, you can misuse the result cache feature and end up delivering dirty data to your users. But we really don't want Oracle to be doing that automatically. So I'm not saying it wouldn't be possible to automatically check, but I think what Kevin would be asking for is every time I call the function with a parameter value, check to, even if it's not result cached, check to see whether anybody's previously requested that data. It's hard to see, Kevin, how it could be automated safely, but I love the sentiment. All right, here's another one. Result cache requires good coordination among developers. If every developer converts his or her function into a result cache function, there'll be a great deal of contention in production mode. Kevin, I have a feeling you've been wrestling with the result cache feature. So yes, without a doubt, the result cache feature is one of those things that's really nice. Specifically, really nice not only because of the potential performance benefits, but the fact that you just add one keyword to your code. You don't have to rewrite anything.
Yeah,
that's really wonderful. But you might walk away from this session, and I'm going to make sure you don't. Do not walk away from this session saying, oh, I'm going to put result cache in all my functions. This is just too fantastic. Everybody's going to love it. Well, everybody might love it, but they'll hate you. So it's one of those features you have to use with great care. And basically what Kevin is talking about there is that every time an entry is made into or a row is added into the cache, there's a latch on that cache. So two people cannot insert into that cache at the same time. You'll get latch contention on that cache. So you have to be very careful about which functions you apply result cache to and how it's loaded. So if you want to use result cache on a given function for a given data set, and you load it up incrementally, but you have a lot of people hammering away through that function at the same time, they can experience a tremendous slowdown. You can basically lock up the application. So one strategy is to actually preload the cache, basically call it in a loop, preload it, get it all set for everyday production use. Other questions, comments?
Mark asks, how does it compare to the deterministic phrase?
So the deterministic, so why don't you go ahead and share my code, share my screen. I stopped sharing, didn't I?
You stopped sharing, you did.
we were doing Zoom for the webinar yesterday, and I have to get used to StreamYard again, which
Yeah.
is just so lovely in comparison for these kinds of things. So deterministic.
Yeah, you had to do it all yourself yesterday.
Yeah, it was so hard.
That's why you like StreamYard better. You must say, Michelle, share my screen.
So deterministic has caching capabilities. So if I declare a function to be deterministic, then when the function is called inside a select statement, the similar kind of caching occurs. The first time for any set of parameter values, the function will be called. Subsequent calls to that function may not be executed. You may be able to use the cache, but the cache for a deterministic function only is valid within the scope of the SQL statement. And it's going to be repeated for each session. So each one of us will have our own little result, our own little cache for that deterministic function execution in that SQL statement. So they're similar in that they're both doing some kind of caching, but in terms of a robust production capability, you want to use result cache, not deterministic. Having said that, you should declare functions to be deterministic when they are, when they don't have side effects, because that's giving more information to the compiler to potentially take advantage of things like this. But they're complementary. They're not in any sense in conflict with each other. And using deterministic does not obviate the use of result cache. If it's a result cached function, deterministic probably won't play that much of a role. Hopefully that helps.
So you'll be happy to know that Niels agrees with you and backs you up on the explanation you just provided.
Excellent. Thank you, Niels. And do we have another? I see Judith has a comment too.
Judith is still responding to Kevin's earlier statement about Oracle helping make some of those determinations about when you should use result cache. So says that Oracle can do it automatically for SQL statements, but it's probably not something you'd want to do. And then,
but it doesn't do it automatically, does it, Judith? You can add can you stop showing my screen? So we
sure.
Stop the infinity effect. So you can actually add a hint to your select statement saying star plus result cache. And then you'll basically have a result cache, much like the function result cache for your query. Think about it. A query is kind of like a function. You've got bind values coming in, like where department ID equals 10. That's like an in parameter. And you've got the select list that returns stuff. So structurally, functionally, queries and functions are very similar. And so Oracle does have a result cache for them. I'm not sure how it can be automated, but listen, I don't want to spend more time on the hypotheticals because I can't do anything about that. Even when I was at Oracle, couldn't do a thing about it. And I've got Jamal says, in case of overloading, the executed function is the cache one based on the parameters. Is that a correct statement? So overloading and result caching really don't intersect in the sense that when you've got overloading, you've got multiple functions with the same name, and either there's a match on the parameter list or there isn't. So if one's result cached and one isn't, it doesn't really matter. At compile time, the compiler will have already decided which one of those things will be called. And Stefan, how long does the cache stay in memory? If I use it for the name of an employee, for example, and call it 15 minutes later after changing the name of the same employee. So the result cache follows the same basic algorithm of any pool within the shared global area, the SGA, which is least recently used. So basically, the DBA has to size that pool to make sense for your application. And that's going to depend on how many functions you apply the result cache to, what kind of data sets, how big each one of those caches get. So they've got to size it right. If they size it too small, then your data will be pushed out in the LRU algorithm, and you really don't want that to happen for the result cache. So obviously, a key factor in using result cache is working with your DBA, making sure it's sized properly. Now, putting that aside, assume that it's sized properly. That data will stay in the cache until the table changes and the changes are committed. So it could be there for days. It could be there for weeks. Oracle database never goes down. And as long as your situation is stable, your code is stable, and again, it might be a materialized view, it might be a static data set, it might have nothing to do with a query, which I'll show you in a moment. It'll just sit there. It will not age out otherwise. And Hemant corrected me for something. I said, no, that's right. I said deterministic was a per session cache. But you're right, Hemant. The result cache hint is also if the same query is executed for multiple sessions, the same result cache pool will be used. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And can you put up Judith's comment? So Judith points out, this is the sort of stuff that I'm so weak on an Oracle database, that there's an actual ability to say, always turn on result cache mode to do it automatically for SQL. Can't imagine, as Judith pointed out, can't imagine you'd actually want to do that. I'm not even sure why that's there, but okay. Okay, share my screen. More fun code to show you. So back to the demo. So I've covered the basics. You've got the idea. Let's take a look at the dirty data issue. So in this piece of code, I'm going to call the last name for 144 twice. The second time it should have been cached. Then I'm going to make a change for the employees table for employee ID 198, not 144. And then let's see what happens. And then I'll do a commit, and then we'll do it all over again. So I run this code. I have to come on, reset. It's now resetting my connection. So we got to wait for a second. But as you'll see the results in just a second, one of the points I want to make here is that it will invalidate the cache for me. I can't access the cache because I made a change to the table. And notice, even though the row I changed, all right, now I can run my code. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so I executed the body just once. The second time it didn't execute the body. And then notice that I made the change, and now every time I call that function, it's executing the function because I changed the table. Any result cache reliant on that table, whether it's this function or 100 other functions, will all be invalidated for me. Then I commit, and now I'm back to caching. So it works as you'd expect, right? If it's dirty data in my session, I'm not going to see that cache. Again, everybody else can still see it until I commit. But the other thing to point out is that the invalidation occurs at the table level. So even though I haven't cached 198, it says, no, sorry, no cache for you. And you could say, well, that's one way they could certainly make it smarter. They could keep track of which IDs and then make sure that only if that ID has been changed. And you know what? Maybe they could, but clearly at some point, Oracle has to balance off the CPU required to figure out whether or not the cache is good or not with saving the CPU by avoiding calling the function. And again, also, you don't want them to get too aggressive and too sophisticated about these kinds of things, because if there's a bug, dirty data delivered to your users. Any more comments I should look at? It looks like a busy day for comments.
Yeah, lots of interaction. Well, Kevin really, really wants Oracle to help him decide which functions to use result cache.
Stop sharing for a second.
Is still
maybe Oracle can auto-suggest a list of functions that are good, and then I can decide. Yeah, it could be, Kevin, and you might, you could even go on Twitter and suggest to Connor or Chris these kinds of ideas. It's not that hard for you to figure it out. So basically, let's talk about use cases for result caches. One big use case is queries against tables that are data sets that are static. So if I have a materialized view, it never changes. So that's always a good candidate, or querying against it is always a good candidate for a result function. But even better, if I have a data set that is queried much more frequently and the same row is queried more frequently, then it's changed. So in other words, it's for significant periods of time, it's like a materialized view. That's also a good candidate. So if, let's say on average, the employees table changes every 10 minutes, but in between those 10 minutes, let's say all the rows are queried thousands of times over and over again, that's a great candidate for the result cache. So not just a fully static data set, but actually mostly static, or static for these periods. Now, the other general use case are things that, even without data in them, in other words, you don't have to run a query to use the function result cache. It could simply be a global constant value. Share my screen again. Do we have other comments? No, that's it.
Nope.
Okay. So cruising down through here some more, let's take a look at this particular package body. So just to make the point, in this particular function, I've got this one row, pass an employee ID, return a record. And notice I'm not actually querying from the table. I'm just constructing a data set for whatever reason and returning it. The point is that I can result cache this as well, and it works the same way. When I pass in the employee ID, the first time it'll cache this, the next time it won't. It's not reliant necessarily on a table. In fact, I can have a function. I'll come back to that one in a second. But let's say I had a function which is called function, test email address is return. Sorry, I should have written this in advance. Result cache. Can you hear the rain? It's pouring.
Is it?
Return.
Also, note to self, don't wear a stripy shirt on StreamYard. Do you see what's going on?
Okay, so now let's say I've got this constant value. It might even be a global in a package, right? So it could be my config package, test email. And so, for example, I think I did a topic on this a while ago. When I do anything with emails, I make sure that when I'm not in production, I can never spam anybody. It always reverts to me, basically, the developer email. So there'll be a case expression in the send procedure. And I can reference the constant. And by the way, for example, I can't reference the constant in SQL because you can't reference global constants. But what I can do is put it inside a function, returns the string, result cache it. This function will only be executed once for everybody in the entire instance for forever, essentially, because there are no parameters. So the first time it's run, it's got this tiny little cache for just one entry, and you'll never have the expense of executing the function again. And the performance difference can be amazing. So now let's take a look at that. So here's an example that's probably a little bit closer to reality. I've got an app config table. You probably have this as well. So for example, what state is the app in? Am I in development, test, production? And if it's in production, then certain things happen like, yeah, you can send the email to everybody. If it's not, you send it to me. So I'm going to create this function. Actually, I don't know if I need to run it. We're running out of time. I ran this before, and I'll show you the results. So I create this function. I run it 1,000,000 times. That's what it used to be. It took 22 seconds to execute this function 1,000,000 times. Then I added the result cache keyword, no other change. 1,000,000 times, 0.3 seconds compared to 22 seconds. So the performance benefit of avoiding calling the function, even a quick function like this, even a function that doesn't have a query in it, is really quite substantial. So this is a really nice way for very small caches, right? So this is a one-row table. It might change very occasionally, but really, really good application for the result cache. Okay. So it doesn't have to be just for things with SQL in them. It can be literally just a cover for, as I was showing you before, a constant. You can now call this in SQL, and you're really not paying much of a cost for that switch to get the value. All right.
I'm just putting up some comments because Niels and Judith are having a conversation amongst themselves.
How does result caching behave if you query a view in the function and you change one of the tables the views is based on? So the answer is Oracle has done it right. When Oracle first released this feature in 11.1, it was really scary because we had to specify what the function relied on. Literally in the list of the result cache header, there would be relies on, and you would have to list out the tables, comma delimited list. And if you got it wrong, you could have some real big problems. And it was like, why, Oracle? Surely you can figure this out for yourself. Lo and behold, 11.2 comes along, boom, taken care of. So very quickly, it was deprecated. They just couldn't get to it for the deadline for 11.1, obviously. So the answer is Oracle figures it out for you automatically with both static and dynamic SQL. Even if it's not called in the very same top-level function that the result cache is on, it might be called through function procedure. It'll figure it all out. And no worries. If it's in a view, it'll break out whatever's in the view and go right down to all those tables and keep track of all of them. And as of 11.2, it actually tracks dependencies on the columns within the tables that you're actually querying from. So if those columns haven't been affected, then you don't have no, I'm sorry. Rephrase that. That's wrong. If I call a function and it's reliant on a couple of tables, it'll keep track of those tables. So let's say I have a function that says if x equals 2, then query from A and B. But if x equals 3, query from B and C. So it'll actually keep track with each row in the cache which tables it relied on. So then if I modify table A, all the rows in the cache for A and C invalidated, removed. But all the rows for B and C not invalidated. Pretty slick. So I think Oracle's gone to great lengths to do it right, cover all the scenarios they could cover safely, and give us a really robust feature. And I think I see another comment from Kevin about I am using RC in my production code. I don't overuse it. Yes. So Kevin, that's really great advice. This is specifically the kind of feature you really want to know about. You want to study well and use with care. And what I'm going to cover, it's 11:30, so I'm going to switch off and we'll cover my book and my organizations and so on. In the next Feuer tip, I want to talk about the kind of ways that you can really screw up with the result cache beyond the issue of not having the pool big enough, because boy, you can really make some big mistakes with the result cache. And yes, Judith, we did have this. We had a whole lot of quizzes on the result cache, and I learned a lot from users like you and Niels as well. Okay, and is there anything from the comments we should go back over? Anything I might have missed?
I think we've covered everything. I just want to say it was such a great show. I love it when we have this kind of active participation. It's
really great.
Lovely, yeah.
All right. So now what I'd like to do is present 3 different organizations, and a person will pick the winner. Do you have the person who will pick the organization?
I should have thought. How about Stefan? Stefan, are you still around? If you can pick the organization that Stephen, one of the 3 that Stephen's about to share.
I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
So 3 organizations for today. Some of them are repeats, but Earth Justice, because the Earth needs a good lawyer. So it would be nice if the Earth didn't need a lawyer. It would be nice if lots of us didn't need lawyers, but lawyers can be really critical. And certainly there are many opportunities where the only way to stop some major devastation from happening is to file a lawsuit and stop projects, stop oil pipelines, and so on. So Earth Justice, and as I've mentioned before, bonobos, the Bonobo Conservation Initiative. You all know about chimpanzees and how close they are genetically to humans. Relatively few people know about bonobos, which are as close as chimps on the evolutionary tree or bush as us. And they're so different from chimps, so different from us. And there are not many of them left, and they only live in Madagascar, and they need help. So help them, and save the giraffes. So there aren't a whole lot of giraffes left either, and boy, megafauna like giraffes are hard to come by in our world because we don't like having big animals that might hurt us. Anyway, let's stick our necks out for giraffes. So giraffes, bonobos, Earth Justice lawyers. So Stefan, is Stefan still there? Did you get a word from him?
I did not.
Okay.
Bonobos.
Bonobos, thank you.
Thank
that would
you,
be my
Stefan.
favorite choice too. And I encourage you to go exploring and find out about them. Okay, then last but not least, my favorite book to offer to you. It's called The Gate to Women's Country. I talked about a book called Grass by Sherry S. Tepper several weeks ago. That's a kind of a pure science fiction novel. She writes a lot of science fiction fantasy. The Gate to Women's Country, I think, not only has it always been one of my favorite books, but it's incredibly important for this moment in the United States. As you may be aware, the state of Texas has virtually outlawed abortion unconstitutionally, very repulsive and disgusting. Hopefully it can be pushed back. But there's been a lot of talk about comparison to Margaret Atwood's Henwood Tales and that kind of post-apocalyptic situation. This is a post-apocalyptic novel as well. And it's set into the future after nuclear catastrophe where women have stepped forth to basically run things. Like, men, wow, turns out you cannot be trusted. So women are running things, and it's just a fascinating book about the kind of society they put together, how men interact, and they certainly still do interact. And it's the sort of thing that will not only, I think, keep you engaged, but there are certain points in that book where you're like, whoa, mind blown. So I always like books like that. So check out The Gate to Women's Country, and hopefully you'll enjoy it as much as I did. Okay, the end of another Feuer tip. So sorry to see you go, but we must move on. I must play with my dog.
You're color coordinated. Your shirt, your dog, your pillow. I love it.
So everybody take care of yourself. Stay safe. Get vaccinated if you haven't been. Stay masked when you go out, especially when you're indoors. Anywhere, let's beat this virus. Let's beat back the people who are really weird about vaccines and masks. And hopefully we'll be in a better place in the months to come. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Everyone, see you next week. No, in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, right?
Bye, everyone.